You're listening to Tune Dig, a podcast for music lovers. The premise is simple. We dig into an album to discover what makes it interesting, and then we dig into the crates for a vinyl copy to give away to one lucky winner.
Go to tunedig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode. Today we're talking about Converge's Axe to Fall.
Dude, holy mother god shit. This band rules so hard.
I told you. Long ago, in a land far, far away. I told you so.
You mean high school? This band is impeccably consistent and sound so good and have set such a precedent in the type of music that they do. And I know that there are scores of people that might turn it on and immediately turn it back off because it's too heavy or too extreme or whatever. But by the same token of Björk being challenging in a certain way, and us talking about that earlier in the season, this really demands a listen. This is real good music.
As I've expressed to you on numerous occasions after we picked this album, it's really frustrating to me that we have to pick an album from this band because Converge is so good and they've been putting together great record after great record for, have they been together 30 years?
At least 25. A long time.
Yeah, and I think 20 years or so with the current lineup.
Which is amazing by any standard, but when you consider the physicality of the music that they make, it's really nothing short of a miracle.
Yeah, and if you're a little less familiar with Converge, you can recognize them the same way that you recognize Misfit shirts and Black Flag shirts, because Converge shirts are right there on the same human beings everywhere. It's this weird monochromatic shadow of a face looking thing that comes from their 2001 masterpiece, I don't mind saying, Jane Doe, which was then followed in the rest of the 2000s by You Fail Me and No Heroes leading up to Axe to Fall. You know, Jane Doe is kind of the standout gold standard of 2000s hardcore or post-hardcore. They kind of reject genre labels in general, but
it changed heavy music forever. I mean, it's in a much smaller scale, but it's same depth of impact. It's like Nevermind level. I mean, it's talked about breathlessly still to this day in that way.
Yeah, Converge is the cred band of all cred bands.
For sure.
Absolutely.
And remarkably, deservedly so.
Well, I think that's the biggest theme for me of talking about this band in relation to other ones. And I'm sure we'll cover a number of reasons this is true, but Converge is probably the only band I can think of that has the DIY aesthetic of punk while also being good at the things that they do.
Right.
Jake is an incredible artist. Kurt is an incredible recording engineer and producer. Nate and Ben are great musicians in their own right and play in a number of other great bands. And then they've stuck together and obviously produced something that's larger than the sum of its parts.
Individually, each component part is great. I know you scoff at me when I use this, but they're like the heavy Beatles, right? It's like there's no Ringo in this group. It's like four titans who go, and you have all these different rabbit holes you can go down with each member to see what their solo aesthetic is. And then the way that it comes together is really beautiful, and it is way more than the sum of its parts. And to truly get that, you got to experience them live to see them all kind of at the height of their powers. This record was the first place for me where I noticed all of those individual things and then was just absolutely barreled. I mean, I was steamrolled. And you got to use big, extreme, physical, kind of violent metaphors to talk about this record because it hits you. It starts right away and it just beats the shit out of you.
I know the word crushing gets used a lot in hardcore reviews, but this crushes you. Yeah. Okay, so I have a mild recollection of this, but this was the first Converge record that got you in on the deal, right?
100%.
So what was the moment that caught you?
So I think a little bit of it was time and place. I think I'd been primed by other things that laddered up to this. So I'd gotten big into Every Time I Die at this point, and they're a lot more fun and cheeky than Converge, but they're obviously influenced, and will say as much, by Converge. And there were enough bands that I really liked that were all different enough that had been pointing in this direction. Like, if you like us, go listen to this band because they rule and they set the standard. Mastodon and High on Fire and Every Time I Die and all these great, really credible bands in their own right are all saying, no. There's also this band. They had just built up enough cred at that point, and the other records sound good. Jane and You Fail Me and No Heroes all sound good, but this record sounds perfect, and it's huge, and it's well mixed, and just nothing stuck to my ribs until this. I also kind of feel like Dark Horse begins the record a little differently than the dynamic of some other Converge records. Like, Dark Horse starts off like a freight train, and it's become one of the iconic Converge songs in the live set because of that, because it's just like, it builds momentum, it kicks up some dust like a horse, and then it just pew.
You take off, and then not too long into the song, the first breakdown of that song happens, and then you understand. Pretty quickly into the record, they have a solid entry-exit point for you. Red pill, blue pill. Is this the thing you want because you're about to get 40 more minutes of this exact thing? If not, probably go ahead and get out now.
There is a really physical thing about it, though, and they do a really good job of like combo punches of songs. They do experimental stuff really well, and I know we'll talk about that. But the first 3 songs on this record for sure are a flurry of body blows, and it builds momentum. So Dark Horse then builds into Reap What You Sow, which then builds into the title track, which is a total uppercut by the time you get to that point. The tempo builds on each of those 3 songs, and it just gets more and more intense and very much matches the intensity in a real way of a live Converge set, where it starts crazy and it only gets more furious from there.
And yet they do a really good job of pacing here. Like, what you're saying is true, but I also want people to hear the way that they really put the songs together. Also a pretty uncommon skill for a hardcore band to figure out how to do pacing in something that's so relentless and almost violent feeling. Because you're right, it builds and builds and builds, and then in acts to follow the track, like a minute or something like that in, the tempo changes, and they do it's a pretty well-known Converge
trope?
Sure, yeah. They're good at building and then really twisting a tempo around. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that they've spent 2.5 songs at that point building into this direction and then just kind of rip it out from under you is how Converge does music. It would be really unbearable to listen to this record and other Converge records if they didn't do that type of pacing well, because it would feel so relentless. Like, I know you've listened to records where it's like, it hurts by the time you take your headphones off and it's just too much. Like, even as a music lover, it's too much. But they do such a good job on this record of like, I'm going to give you just a little bit of time to catch your breath, and then we're going to do it again for just long enough and then pull back.
The reprieve of the tempo of Dark Horse is just in those little breakdowns that you talk about, but they're not overwrought, where like other bands would take that idea and do it for the whole last minute of a song. They do it and then leave it and go on to the next thing, and then don't do that same approach for letting out the steam of Reap What You Sow on the second track. Instead, they get Sean Martin from Hatebreed We'll talk about the collaborations. And he does this like screaming eagle guitar solo, right? So it's the same sort of mental thing, but they handle it a totally different way. And then by the time you're really ready for it, because they've just been landing blow after blow, and they're kind of like snowballing downhill at this point, the end of Axopal is still like one of the hardest things that I've ever heard. It's super duper tough. And beautifully enough, it's the song about depression. So there's the tension between Bannon's whole deal, which is like uncomfortable emotiveness, but it's indecipherable all the time, and it sits really nicely in the mix. But dude, by the time they get to the slow part at the end of Axopal, it's super gnarly. It's like a big executioner's axe coming down, and I think that was when I decided I was a Converge fan, because it was just like, holy shit, this is the most badass thing I've ever heard in my life. It's rad in a way that most heavy bands try their whole careers to summon and cannot, and it's like the most effortless part of the Converge repertoire.
Talking about Jacob Bannon's role, I think, is one specific way to hear this band apart from their contemporaries. Vocals are in the mix correctly on this band and are incorrect in pretty much every other heavy band in existence.
Yep.
The view of him as an instrument is critical to actually mixing him appropriately in relation to the guitar and everything else. Like, heavy bands really overdo it on the high end, kind of abrasive part of the sonic spectrum, and they kind of shove everything up in their guitar and vocals and whatever. And in order to separate out the vocals, it seems like at least they tend to boost the volume so that you can hear it separate from guitar, and you end up with this kind of unnatural feel, because that's not usually what a live heavy band sounds like, right? It's lost in that noise and all the reverberation, which we should keep mentioning is a big reason Converge is so great, because they sound this great live,
if not better.
Yeah. You even kind of mentioned this feeling of really building tension. I remember the last time that we saw them, that when they played Dark Horse, the literal sound and mix of them playing at that moment started to feel like it was all going to come apart. Like the sound started to get too big to be controlled, and almost like it was on the verge of just a massive bit of feedback. And somehow it barely stayed together. And then I don't know if they adjusted anything or if that was just purely planned, but like it smoothed itself out and never really had an abrupt change to it. And to me, that's one of the themes of this record that's really on display, that I can see them working through in the production in the records past, where they have these really complex parts. Like you mentioned, Reap What You Sow. Like about a minute and a half into it, they have this really tight little kind of guitar and drum.
Yeah, hell yeah.
So that would sound like garbage without the right production and without really matching the tones and the attack of the guitar and the drums. But you can see that in opposition to other places throughout the record where he's playing, saying a simple guitar part would be really betraying it.
A less complex.
Yeah. And it's never a clean guitar sound. It's almost like if the musical part itself is too straightforward, the production and tone of it, Kurt Ballou distorts it until it's just abrasive enough. Like everything is always right on that line of feeling a little too much and a little like it's going to fall apart. But it's never just the production or just the instruments or just the songwriting or just Jacob Bannon. It's always a mixture between everybody and making all of those things together sound like one giant noise.
Well, that's the genius of the Fifth Man, right?
Yeah.
It can't be underscored enough, the importance of them having God City. Kurt was an aerospace engineer, and he got laid off, and he used his severance to invest in the equipment that would become God City, which is an incredible story.
See, cred band of all cred bands, right?
And you watch any interview with him, any like Secrets of the Sound type thing where they go to God City, and you see how borderline obsessive he is. His attention to detail is really incredible.